Drini Gear, Global Director, Child Rights, Equality, and Social Justice at Save the Children. Thanks for joining us today. As we just heard, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres saying gender equality is 300 years away and that progress made over the past few decades is vanishing. It's so discouraging to hear. Why have we taken steps backwards, specifically in the Asia-Pacific region?
When we look at the situation of girls and women, we have to look across all levels of society, from the classrooms to the courtrooms to the judiciary. And we see that as we move up through society, we see less and less women and girls represented. So it means that when we have to tackle gender inequality, we have to do it from a large systemic approach, looking at all levels of society. Research shows that as early as age 6, girls' levels of ambition and self-confidence in their abilities are negatively impacted by discriminatory gender norms as compared to their brothers. So we know that girls are watching. They're looking to see where are their mothers, their sisters, where are they in society. And of course, when we look at what happened with COVID, it set gender equality backwards. Whenever there are crises, pandemics, conflicts, girls and women face the brunt of these struggles. And so when we see marginal improvements in some areas or the other, we know that it could easily swing backwards, and that's what happened during the COVID time. So when we consider girls' inequality and women's inequality, we have to constantly be aware that we have to have the right investment. It has to be an all society investment and an approach to tackling it.
Yeah, Drini, the situation sounds pretty bad in general, but must definitely be exacerbated in countries and regions facing conflicts. You briefly mentioned it just now, but how worried are you about the situation in Ukraine right now and the effects it's having on women and girls?
Well, Save the Children just did a recent study to look at how conflict affected girls and women. And we analyzed data for more than 2 million women across 56 countries over the last 3 decades. And we looked at girls who got married as children and also who lived within 50 kilometers of an armed conflict. And what we learned was that 1 in 5 adolescent girls lives within a conflict zone. And these girls have heightened risks to their human rights being violated, as well as physical and mental health challenges, increased levels of gender-based violence, which includes child marriage. So we know that girls affected by conflict are 20% more likely to marry as children than those living outside of conflict zones. When we look specifically at Asia, we know that it's even higher than 20%, that risk of child marriage when linked to conflict. And so, child marriage is a form of gender-based violence. And even when we look at the responses to gender-based violence in situations like the Ukraine or any other crisis-affected country, we know that there's very little funding flowing in even to look at gender-based violence. So we know that, it's really important that we have funding targets that already tackle gender-based violence. And although research is helpful, we need to recognize from the get-go that we can't wait for girls to prove that they're experiencing gender-based violence. Governments and organizations need to respond to humanitarian crisis, must work with women and girls and their communities to understand what their needs are in conflict and to adequately fund that area.
Drini, when it comes to the digital divide, 3 billion people still not connected to the internet, the majority of them women and girls in developing countries. Also a shortfall of females in the tech industry. How important is access to tech and what is blocking women from it?
It's so important. We know that our lives are becoming more and more centralized around technology. And so when we look at the sort of realization of our rights, exercising our rights, being able to participate, we know that access to technology is so important. But the challenges too is that online spaces, they were not created with safety in mind. They were not carved out for girls and women. And so when we look at safety online, it's a huge issue. We've learned that even there's been recently a 150% increase in child online sexual abuse materials. There's been, 59% of adolescents in a U.S. study had been bullied or harassed online. We know that 58% of girls and women in a recent large-scale survey reported that they had personally experienced some form of online harassment on social media platforms. So the digital divide is absolutely, a much bigger one when we look at girls and women. But right now, what we're doing as Save the Children is we're supporting 2 girls from Indonesia Indonesia's Child and Youth Advocacy Network, to attend the Commission on Status of Women that's being currently held in New York to speak to world leaders about this year's theme, which is gender equality in access to digital technology and safety online. So their group, which is known as CYAN, has identified digital literacy as a key priority for girls and young people in Indonesia. So we know that when world leaders meet in New York, that hopefully we'll have some girls and young people there to speak to them about how important for gender equality is a safe online experience.
And any climate change, of course, is one of the greatest challenges of our time. We often hear the climate crisis is not gender neutral. How do they impact women and girls? And what is your organization doing to support solutions for them?
Well, as I said earlier, when we look at any kind of crisis or major conflict or any big problem like a pandemic and the climate change, it always has a differential impact on girls and women. And we know that, that girls, women, they bear the brunt of these crises. The girls are the first ones pulled out of school. They're brought closer to home. That protection sometimes prevents them then from accessing all sorts of societal devices like school or even for instance girls with disabilities. When crises like these hit, they're also have less access to even interventions that would normally allow their access to school. And that's true for climate as well. So when we look at whether it's gender neutral. So we know that climate change has the biggest impact on communities connected to land. We know that women and girls are the farmers of the world. And if we then consider girls, women from indigenous communities, the link to land is even stronger. So they're disproportionately affected and are less resilient to the impacts of climate change. So we at Save the Children, we recognize there's an inextricable link between climate change and gender inequality. So our work to address climate change is concurrently tackles not only climate change, but the structural drivers of gender inequality. So we've been sort of targeting both girls' education and sexual reproductive health and rights, because we know that has been cited as great powerful levers for mitigating the effects of climate change on girls and women. So a lot of our programs are targeting specifically reproductive health services as well as education to just sort of help shore up that resilience to climate change impacts.
All right. Thank you very much for your time today, Drini. We'll leave it there. Drini Gear, Global Director, Child Rights, Equality, and Social Justice at Save the Children.